impact that this move will have as far as the food crisis is concerned, and the impact that the Russia-Ukraine war has already had when it comes to food insecurity. Now, before the pandemic, 135 million people were food insecure. That number was already bad enough. Now, 276 million people across the world have no food security. Over 500,000 are experiencing famines. These are all signs of a global food crisis, one that will only worsen in the coming days. Well, it all started with the COVID-19 pandemic. For 2 years, the global food market was reeling. There were supply chain bottlenecks, export restrictions, and tightening food stocks. But just when things were getting better, the war broke out in Ukraine. Wars can be terrible for supply chains, especially when it is being fought between key agricultural suppliers. Both Russia and Ukraine are global export leaders. They are leading exporters of wheat, barley, corn, sunflower seed, and sunflower oil. So as soon as the war started, the prices skyrocketed. Let me get straight to the numbers now. Sugar prices rose by 21.8%. Meat, 21.9%, dairy was up by 47.1%, and oil prices up by a whopping 137%. Russia is also the world's largest wheat exporter. They make up 17% of the global exports. Ukraine, on the other hand, is the 5th largest, accounting for almost 10% of the global exports. So together, the two account for almost 30% of the world's wheat supply. And that is a huge chunk of supply that was just impacted overnight. Both the countries tried to keep up with the demand, but that was almost impossible. So naturally, there were consequences. Here's a look at the countries that were worst affected. The first one being Egypt. It is the biggest wheat importer in the world. Turkey comes second, Bangladesh third, and then come Nigeria, Yemen, Azerbaijan, and the Sudan. Also on the list are Libya, Lebanon, and Tunisia. Now, things got so bad that this fueled protests across the world. From Latin America to West Asia, people have been taking to the streets. In some countries, prices of essential items shot up by as much as 300%, a move that triggered widespread unrest. The UN Food Agency says prices hit an all-time record in February and then again in March. So the biggest question is, when will the prices come down? Well, that is hard to say. Production depends on very hard-to-predict factors. But the problem cannot be solved without Russia and Ukraine. Restoring their output is crucial for global food security, or else meals on the table will just get more and more expensive. I want to go back across to David, who's with us for more perspectives on this. David, your assessment of the impact that the war has already had when it comes to global food security and the protests that we've seen in different parts of the world as a result of the anger that is simmering on the ground. What is your assessment of where things are headed at this point?
Yes, it's one disaster after another, as if COVID wasn't bad enough in terms of the impact of global supply chains or indeed the production of food. The war in Ukraine, of course, has made that much more intense and much more locally focused. As your report indicated, certain countries are particularly dependent on that fuel. But again, on that food. But again, it comes back to who is to blame for the main problem here. It is Russia. Russia, not only in terms of the invasion, but the Ukrainian ports, that the granaries are full of wheat and that they're full of flour, and they have an incapacity to take in more stuff that's been harvested because the Russians are blockading the Ukrainian post and preventing that food from being exported. So there's food there. The Ukrainians wanted to export it. They need it for their economy, but the Russian fleet in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea are preventing that from happening. So again, it's even more reason why this aggressive war needs to be ended, why the Russians need to actually stop their aggression in the Ukraine so that actually trade can be restored and the global food supplies can be moved. But countries are moving in ways to try and mitigate the damage. So in the United Kingdom, for example, the government has pledged to send £400 to every household to help them deal with the cost of living crisis brought on by the war in Ukraine and elsewhere. And many other countries are doing the same things. In the same way that the governments had to respond to the pandemic by borrowing money and allowing the crisis to be mitigated, the same thing will happen with the food crisis now, because this is not something which can be solved in the short term, and until Russia stops its aggressive war, then there is no prospect of that being ended.
Right, I was just coming to that. So the fiscal measures, the temporary fiscal measures that some countries have already resorted to, impacting the fiscal consolidation that they have achieved post the COVID-19 crisis. But what options do the worst affected countries really have, according to you?
Well, again, their options are much more limited, but there needs to be a concentrated international effort to provide food relief to those countries that aren't in a position to act in the way in which rich countries are, and therefore the United Nations are making clear that they're planning to do just that. But actually, there also needs to be better terms of finance made available to them so they can borrow in order to buy wheat from elsewhere. There is enough food to go around in the world. It's a question of actually the access to it rather than anything else. The impacts are locally felt in places like Egypt and Tunisia. It's up to the international community as well as those states to work hand in hand to make sure that they don't lead to food shortages.
David, thanks very much for being here on the broadcast and sharing those perspectives and providing your assessment of the impact that the war has had on the global food situation and the energy crisis as well. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.